Hi, 8th graders, and welcome to a new week. And today we are going to be looking at adjective clauses. Now, we have also looked at adjective phrases, and guess what? We're going to see adverbs in a few weeks. We're going to be doing the whole phrase and clause thing with them. So let's take a look and remind ourselves of what phrases and clauses actually are. Now, hopefully this is ingrained in your brain at this point. But remember, phrases are not a complete thought. And there are lots of different phrases. You can have infinitive phrases, verbal phrases, adjective phrases, prepositional phrases. And they can be 2 words, or they can be 4, 5, 6 words. You can have multiple phrases in a sentence, especially with prepositional phrases. I know that some of my students sometimes ask if there's a limit on the number of phrases, and certainly not, as long as they all make sense. Then let's talk about what clauses are. And clauses will have a subject and a verb. And remember, they can be dependent or independent. Now let me just go over quickly what a dependent and independent clause will look like. Remember, the independent clauses are like your parents, and they can function on their own. That means they can stand alone as a sentence. And remember, our clauses have the subject and a verb in them. With who, which clauses, the who and sometimes the which can be your subject. So you can have a number of independent clauses together in a sentence if they're connected by a conjunction, but many times you'll have an independent that has a dependent clause or several attached to it. And a dependent clause cannot stand by itself. That's simply the difference. It just can't stand by itself. It has a subject and verb, but it still can't stand alone. It needs more. So we can have verbal clauses, we can have noun clauses, we can have adjective clauses. So now we are moving into the adjective clause piece. Now, do you think that an adjective clause can stand by itself? Well, if all of you are shouting enthusiastically, no, it can't stand by itself, you're right. So let's take a look at the gray box. And here's one of the first things. An adjective clause is a dependent clause that modifies a substantive or a noun in the sentence. It will be introduced by a relative pronoun or a relative adverb. So, the key thing to remember here is adjective clauses will not stand by themselves. They're dependent. That means they have to be attached to something else in the sentence, a noun. And they're going to be introduced by a relative pronoun or relative adverb. And we will look at those in a minute. So you've already been introduced to that word relative. So if you are unsure of what it is, please go pull out your pronoun help sheet, and that will fill you in. Now, there's 2 other categories that we want to discuss here. We have restrictive, non-restrictive. Now, if you have something that's restrictive, it means there's probably a great need of having rules, having a fence. Think of those kinds of things. If we have a restrictive yard, that means I have a fence around it. I need that fence for some reason. A restrictive adjective clause is needed to actually make the meaning of the sentence very clear. A non-restrictive clause is not necessarily needed in the sentence to make the meaning clear. So just remember, restrictive means something that's absolutely needed, and non-restrictive is not necessarily needed. All right. An adjective clause is dependent. We've talked about that already. In the sentences that we have here for examples, we are going to give you 3 examples of adjectives. So King Saul was a tall man. What kind of man was he? He was tall. King Saul was a man of unusual height. Well, what kind of man was he? a man of unusual height. And that is a prepositional phrase. Then King Saul was a man who stood head and shoulders above others. Now, here is where we have shifted from a clause up here down, or excuse me, a phrase up here down to a clause right here. The who which clause introduced by the relative pronoun. You guys should be familiar with these. Here's our subject, who. What did he do? Stood. So there's the subject and the verb, but notice it can't stand by itself, who stood head and shoulders above the others. That can, if it was a question, it could, but it can't stand by itself. It is modifying man, just like unusual height is modifying man here, and tall is modifying man here. So basically, you are looking at who which clauses. And so here's one for an example. Okay, let's move to a little bit of diagramming, as this is going to illustrate for us in visual form. And I'm sorry that this is a little blurry, but it illustrates for us in visual form kind of how this all works. So if you are looking at page 443, my examples seem to be a little bit backwards, but look at the top of 443. And we have a sample here. The man they rescued is my uncle. They have given this example because it shows us how to use the understood, that, or whom in those clauses where it's not evident. So let me break this down a little bit for you. This is one of those that has two lines. You have the independent clause above on top, and you have the dependent clause on the bottom. So let's first figure out the main idea of what's going on here. The man they rescued is my uncle. Well, we need to figure out the main thing, and it looks like man. Man would be the subject. It's hard to ask the Shirley questions on this because of the linking verb here. But you should be able to determine what the main subject is. That would be man. Man what is. And then we have the backslash for uncle. We have the predicate nominative right here. We put in our adjectives, pretty simple. But then we have that little dotted line because we have a small who which clause here. Now, all they show us is they rescued. The man they rescued. And you're probably thinking, well, there's not a who, there's not a which, and there's not a that. Well, it's because it's understood. And if you've been with the IEW writing program for long enough, you will know that there can be an invisible who, which, or that. This is the invisible. So we could stick that in there, and we could stick whom. We could say the man that they rescued is my uncle. We could say the man whom they rescued is my uncle. And both of those make sense. That's why it's understood and put in parentheses. Then, what is the subject and verb? They rescued. So because you can find that subject and the verb, you have to assume that whom or that is part of it, and that's going to be the direct object. So that's the hardest one. We're going to pop onto some of these other examples that they've promised. So let me see if this is any kind of order, or let's find what we want to do first. So this is the top one on page 442. This one's going to be a little bit more clear cut. So let's read it. The Lord whom we worship is the one who created the universe. Well, every time you see a who which clause or whom, you are going to have a different line. So we're going to have the main line, and then we have to have a different line for each who, whom, or that appears. So let's figure out the main line first. So as we look at this, we know it can't be the clause with whom in it. And we know it can't be the clause with who in it. That we are left with the Lord is the one. That needs to be the main clause. So here we are. Lord is backslash, because we have a linking verb, one. Our article adjectives, you should be putting those in your diagrams now. They will be starting to count for points on tests and quizzes. But then you have whose and whom's appearing. That means each one of these who and whom's has to appear on a lower line. So notice how they have put it here. So the first one comes off the Lord whom we worship. And you need to ask the questions. Who is worshiping? We. What are we doing? Worship. Therefore, whom comes as the direct object. We worship whom. And that is connected like this. Whom we know is objective case. It's got to come in the direct object spot. So don't ever put it up here in the subject. Then our other line. And this one is the one who created the universe. In this case, who can be the subject. Remember, it is in the nominative case. Who did what? Created. Created what? Universe. So that's why we have these two minor independent clauses diagrammed underneath the main clause. Okay, let's look at the next one. Jesus, whose voice stilled the tempest, is the Prince of Peace. So again, it's a whole issue of just pulling parts out. So we're going to take the whose voice stilled the tempest. We're going to completely pull that out. And that leaves our main independent clause. Jesus is the Prince of Peace. Jesus is backslash Prince of Peace. Then we just have to figure out how to diagram the next piece. We know there's a dotted line that's going to go down here. And we know that we're going to have another straight line. We just have to figure out what is what. So then we have whose. Now, if we are remembering correctly, whose is going to be possessive. And it's going to be a possessive adjective. Our third graders know that. And therefore, we have to ask the question, what stilled the tempest? Well, voice did. So we put voice in the subject spot, not whose. Voice did what? Stilled. Voice stilled what? Tempest. The word the. And then you've got to decide where does whose go. And a lot of you want to stick it right here on this line. But since it is modifying voice, it has to go down under here, and that's where the connection is made then to Jesus. That one's a little harder, but what I would encourage you to do is to put each of these examples in your notes so that you write it down and you remember, okay, here's where whose shows up because it's possessive and it's going to show up as an adjective. Then here's where whom shows up because it's objective case. And here is where who shows up because it is nominative case. So try to remember all three of those and where they show up in the diagram. And then finally, the last one, Bethel is the place where Jacob saw a vision of angels. Now here we have where. And so that one's going to bring a little confusion to the table. But it says where relates the cause to where Jacob saw the vision. So there's where the relation comes in. Here's where it's going to be connected. Well, let's go back and ask the questions first. What is our main clause? Well, if we take where Jacob saw a vision of angels, that's dependent. It doesn't make sense on its own. We're left with Bethel is the place. Bethel is backslash place. But then where Jacob saw a vision of angels is modifying place. So we draw our dotted line and we know that we're going to have a subject and verb. So who saw? Jacob saw. What did Jacob see? Or what did Jacob do? He saw. Jacob saw what? Vision. So there's how our diagram works. They drop a prepositional phrase here. Vision of what? Of angels. This is also an adjective. The word a, and then where is going to go beside saw because this is an adverb. And the adverb's going to come down off the verb. So lots of things to remember there, and I would encourage you, if you're unsure about this, to come and kind of go through this again. But let me talk about two more things. And I want to talk about the the restrictive clause, restrictive adjective clause, and the non-restrictive adjective clause. And sometimes you need it, sometimes you don't. We're going to look at these in class practice. So here's an example of something that's really needed. The heifers that Father sold to Mr. Graybill are in this pen. Now, if I didn't put that who, which clause that Father sold to Mr. Graybill, if I didn't put that in there, it would be very unclear. It would just be the heifers are in this pen. Could mean any heifers. So I need that. Now, if I look down at the unrestricted or the non-restrictive, the sentence that says Jesus Christ, who gave his life on Calvary as the Savior of the world, who gave his life on Calvary isn't necessarily needed, because you could put it in there, but it is more adding description than being necessary. We all know that he gave his life. We know a lot of other things about him. And finally, we do know that he is the Savior of the world. It's not like I have to set him apart from other saviors of the world. There's just that one. The other example in your book, 443, our house, which was built 100 years ago, is still in good condition. You don't necessarily need to know the date. Our house is still in good condition. You're just adding a little bit more information. So try to remember that as you take a look at some of the class practice and homework. So let's take a look at class practice, and I want you to, we're going to first take a look at A, and I want you to look at 1, 2, and 3 and make a determination about what word the clauses are modifying. And so hit pause, go through, and just kind of think about it. And then when you're ready, unpause and we'll go over those. Okay, if you're back, I'm assuming you've either jotted down on paper or have it in your head. But in number 1, the prophets who warned the sinful people were not always appreciated. Who warned the sinful people is modifying prophets. Number 2, the summer fruit God showed to Amos signified an end. And God showed to Amos is going to modify fruit. That could also be the summer fruit which God showed. So, or that. So it's that understood who which clause. And finally, Jeremiah was the weeping prophet whose people had gone into captivity. The clause is whose people had gone into captivity, and it is modifying prophet. Okay, turn over to B, and this is where we're going to have a little bit of practice with the restrictive, non-restrictive. So remember that when you have restrictive and non-restrictive, with non-restrictive you do need some commas, and I'll point those out when we do them. Restrictive, you don't always need the commas, so we'll talk about those as you do them. So on B, I'll do 1 to 3, and then hit pause, do 1 to 3, and then come back when you've done that. So if you're back, I'm assuming that you've done 1 to 3, and you're dying to know the answers. The 10 Commandments which God gave to Moses on Mount Sinai represent basic principles of righteousness. So we need to figure out the clauses which God gave to Moses on Mount Sinai. Well, do we need it in there? Not really. Most people have heard of the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments represent basic principles of righteousness. So we don't need commas to separate anything. Some people will put them in. They'll put a comma after commandments and after Sinai, but you can get away without them. The second one, the new commandment that Jesus gave was the commandment of love. So we look at that one, and we kind of need to put that Jesus gave in there, because otherwise we would be asking, well, what new commandment? Did it come with Moses? Did it come later in the Old Testament? We need to clarify that Jesus gave it. That one's not going to need any commas as well. The ark that Noah built was designed by God himself. Do we need that Noah built? Sort of, because we just need to make sure that people are clarified on the point that it was Noah that built it. Some might argue that, hey, the ark is kind of well known, it wouldn't need it. So either way you went on that is fine, but I would say it's restrictive and doesn't need any commas. In the next one, Noah, who found grace in the eyes of the Lord, preserved the faith in his generation. I would put commas before and after the who which clause. So you just have to determine as you read whether you pause or not. So hopefully that has helped you a little bit. You have some homework for this chapter, I believe, tomorrow. So let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you in class.